Right, okay, welcome everybody to this. This is the second session I'm doing today on the Microsoft Graph, how it works. So we'll talk a little bit about the Microsoft Graph, what it is, what its purpose is. We'll see a few examples of using it, and we'll look at a little bit of the underlying technology, particularly around authorization, which is can be a little bit scary. So a bit of a better understanding of how that works. So I hope this is going to be useful. And everybody here was in the session this morning, yes? No? Oh, so I have to explain to you, I have to go through this boring slide, this boring slide of who I am. Yes, okay. Well, it's by far the most boring slide in the deck. So my name is Bill Ayers. I'm a Microsoft Certified Master. Amongst other things, I do a bit of training. Microsoft very kindly made me an MVP as well, and I've got numerous qualifications. And as you'd expect, this is my filtered list of the ones that are relevant. And my background is mainly doing consulting around SharePoint and Office 365. I also do a little bit of training and a bit of mobile development as well. So these are all topics that kind of intersect with those various. I am based in the UK. Yes, I kind of assumed that was obvious, but yes, I come in Derbyshire. So my base is Sheffield, but I live in with a family in Derbyshire, which is in the kind of North Midlands between Manchester and Sheffield, for those who are interested. And there's my contact details if you want to perhaps send me an email afterwards. I'll try and help you if I can, or follow me on Twitter if that's your thing, and retweet and so on. And that's my background, so I can move on to our agenda. So I'll talk a little bit about the motivation for this cloud first. We'll talk about REST and OData a little bit. We'll recap, we did touch on that this morning. We'll talk about single sign-on, these different APIs, when to use which API, some of the client libraries, a little bit of the forward-looking stuff, and we'll see a few tools that we can use that will make it a lot easier to work with these APIs and experiment with them and find out what we want and get wrapper APIs that will make our jobs of developing a lot easier. So this was the not at the last Ignite, but maybe the one before or the one before that. It was very much about all mobile first, cloud first, and we're kind of thinking which one is it, and I think it's kind of both really. You know, it's a combination. Really, the cloud is part of this sort of mobility story that we want to be able to be connected wherever we are, and so we're kind of moving away from this sort of PC-centric world and everything's interconnected, and we're using cloud services. Microsoft definitely see themselves as a cloud company moving forward and a cloud supplier, so not so much supplying the software that runs on your PCs, but the thing that it connects to with Office 365 and cognitive services and Azure. All these are part of their the sort of cloud delivery model, which has been very successful. Office 365 has now got something like 100 million users, so it's a really useful platform. If you broaden it out, the number of people using the Office products generally is in the it's over 1 billion people using that. There are about 400 million people have Microsoft Live accounts, however many million tens of millions of LinkedIn users, so people using these cloud services. So it's a useful development platform to target because we can deliver a lot of functionality to a lot of people this way. So we've got this sort of devices and services approach, which we're seeing now, where before we would, as we discussed this morning, we might build our solutions on top of SharePoint as a platform running in the server. Now we more see SharePoint and Office 365 kind of necessarily as a remote service that we're going to consume in some way, and that might be from a mobile device, from a desktop device, a server that we've got running somewhere, possibly in the cloud, that's going to itself reach out. But those have slightly different interaction models, and we need slightly different authorization models and security models around them. So we'll look at a few of those. And yeah, increasingly there's the Microsoft Graph, which really is the topic of this talk, and cognitive services. We might sort of see that come under that same umbrella as well. So the idea is to use REST, which is the backronym for representational state transfer, which is a rather sort of academic, I think it was actually somebody's thesis that originally came up with this term, but it's really talking about using HTTP verbs as a mechanism, and the transport layer security is the way of talking to back-end systems rather than building these very complex SOAP. SOAP used to stand for Simple Object Access Protocol, and there's nothing simple about it. So we kind of got bogged down in all that, and then REST was a kind of a fresh air, breath of fresh air, new approach to doing things much more simply. So that's REST, and we build these URLs. And we can actually build these in the browser, subject to having the appropriate authorization, but we can actually build some of these requests if we're already authenticated against some back-end service like SharePoint Online, for example. So these are the building bricks, and then we've got this OData. We talked again about this briefly this morning, which is a protocol for kind of really further refines this is an open standard for how we can build queries against these endpoints as well, so it's even more structured. And as these have matured, and they've been through several revisions, we're now at OData 4, then some of these endpoints have had to adapt and come up with new versions, and in some cases we've kind of said let's just leave that as a legacy API and we'll move forward with these new standards with some of the newer APIs, and Microsoft Graph comes into that category. And then we'll talk a bit about OAuth, the authorization protocol. And we can talk to REST using JavaScript. You know, it's very easy. It really well adapted to client-side development and the sort of techniques we talked about this morning, because the data is coming back in typically JSON format. Now you can say, you know, when you send your request, I want JSON or I want XML. They'll usually support both standards, but if you get JSON data back, it's kind of already in the JavaScript object form, so we don't really have to do any extra work. We've got a JavaScript object to work with when it comes back. Some people use the jQuery Ajax method, which is one way of doing it. There's a native JavaScript function if you don't want to take a dependency on jQuery, which kind of used to be the norm, but now it's perhaps not quite so essential. Then there is a native JavaScript API that we can use, this XHR XML HTTP request. So that is, I mean, that's very simplified. Would normally, in this situation, we'd want to send an access token. We'll talk about access tokens a little bit later, because that's sort of going to form a part of what we, how we sort of understand the underlying technology. So, what is Microsoft Graph? It's a kind of wrapper API, I suppose, is the best way to look at it. So, Microsoft have developed a sequence of APIs for these, particularly for these server-side products. So that includes Azure AD, for example. There is the Office 365, there's like the Outlook endpoint in Office 365. There's SharePoint, which has its own REST API. There's a few others, you know, Mail and Calendar, part of Outlook. We're getting more coming along all the time. But some of those are using, particularly, for example, the SharePoint REST API uses slightly older standards, and as the technologies are gradually developed, there have been newer standards, and so it gives us an opportunity to have a fresh API that wraps all of these. So these, I want to say legacy API isn't quite the right phrase, but the sort of the native, I can't really find quite the right word to describe it. So the native APIs for those platforms, they are, well, yeah, you could say that. That's a good choice of word. Yes. So these existing APIs for these products, as it were, are then wrapped by this kind of general purpose API, and that's getting bigger and bigger, and there's a lot of investment in this graph.microsoft.com endpoint. So one of the problems with these is, apart from they tend to get a little bit out of date in the structure, is you also have to have a separate token, an access token for each of these, whereas from the graph endpoint we can do it with a single access token. So that greatly simplifies the whole process of identifying these endpoints. There's sort of like a discovery process for finding the endpoints and getting an access token for each of those, and I'll explain what I mean by access token in a minute. We can do there's just this one endpoint that we can use, and one access token gives us an endpoint that encompasses all of these. And in addition, there is a mechanism that we used to call the Office graph, and they're not using that term so much now. It tends to be referred to more generally as insights, but so Office graph was a bit confusing naming when you have Microsoft graph and Office graph, and so this is really a kind of a search process going over all these endpoints, and then it's discovering a little bit of AI as well, a bit of machine learning, and it's discovering insights around all that data, like who am I working with, and what kind of documents I'm likely to be interested in. And that's given us another endpoint which itself can be accessed through this Microsoft graph wrapper endpoint. So that's one of the things that, for example, Delve uses to surface its suggested reading and things like that. So one token, one endpoint, greatly simplifies things. And that's what the Microsoft graph is. And then all these are starting to be added. So a lot of these were announced at Ignite last week. More SharePoint data, OneNote Planner, which is like a little bit like anybody use Planner? I quite like it actually. It's like Trello is a sort of a similar product to that. Teams, Microsoft Teams. Excel as an endpoint, Intune, Azure AD, and not yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if at some point LinkedIn, all that data was available through here, but that's not available yet. Although you could get to it, I suppose, through their own endpoint. So this is not it looks like a marketing slide. And yet it's much more than that, because it shows you how you can use this graph to get around from one point to another. And so you can start with the user, and then you can kind of pivot and then find yourself at, say, somebody that they work with, and then that's a starting point, and you can pivot around there. And so you can traverse this graph by following all these interconnected nodes, which are the sort of, I suppose, represent the structure of the organization, or the information in that organization. So it's really a very powerful mechanism to, as you traverse and follow these links. So these are variously called nodes or vertices, depending on which person you ask in terms of the general terminology behind this. So the word graph means it's a general term, it's kind of a mathematics term for an interconnected series of nodes or vertices, and these are the paths between them. And they can be directional or bidirectional. So say the manager relationship is directional, this person is this person's manager, and there's a report to direct, this person is a direct report. So from the point of view of this node here, that will be the manager link, but going in the opposite direction. But working with, which is one of these insights that the search engine has determined that these two people, from their behavior, must be working together. That's kind of a bidirectional link. That's just connecting those two nodes. But it has no particular direction. So that's a sort of graph. There's a whole mathematical theory about how these things are modeled and how they're interconnected, and it becomes a very complex thing of all these interconnections. And it reminds me a little bit of another set of interconnected nodes, which is this rather beautiful picture is a technique that the neuroscientists use to, or researchers use to identify individual neurons in a brain of some animal, presumably, one would hope. And yeah, you can dye the individual neurons different colors, and they can actually, on some of these simpler brains, can sort of follow the connections and work out how they work. So it's almost yeah, like the same mechanism, this sort of very complex interconnection between different objects that's being modeled by the Microsoft Graph. And we'll kind of return to that topic a little bit at the end, sort of slightly sinister implications. Anyway, there have been a few more announcements at Ignite, so SharePoint lists and sites have become generally available, Planner, OneNote, and there are more things coming and they're in preview now, so maybe over the next 6 months I would expect most of those to become generally available, but they haven't committed to any particular time frame for it. But you know, more and more material is becoming available through the graph, so it's becoming increasingly attractive as a API endpoint to target for development work. Project Roam is to do think of roam as roaming, as in your profile that roams around with you. So you've got, you know, some other computer and you connect it up, and it's got your desktop and your background and all your. I think it's a pun. Yeah, I think it's a play on words, intentional. I think, yes, I think it's intentional. But it does help you remember what they're talking about. Yeah, and Intune is, you know, that's to do with mobile management, and so if you remember or if you've noticed, there's been quite a lot of talk about Microsoft 365. So first time I saw Microsoft 365, I thought it was a mistake. It was Office 365, they got mixed up. Yeah, but there's a Microsoft 365 offering, which is really a bundling of Office 365 along with Windows 10, and then all these Intune and these sort of services for mobile management. So it's really, you know, giving you, in the same way that on Office 365 you've got that Pro Plus thing that will push stuff onto your desktop and keep it all in sync, and it's the whole package now, that you can mechanisms very quickly and provision a PC and install everything on there, so that you've got a familiar environment. So that's all starting to be part of the same story. Anyway, we digress slightly. So the API looks like this. So it's graph.microsoft.com. So nice, easy to remember endpoint, and then we've got the verb, of course, which will decide whether we're getting data or putting it or updating or deleting objects. We've got a version in that URL, which is the normally either 1.0 or beta, but you know, there'll be a 2.0 in due course, and then we have these different resources, so users, groups, sites, drives. Sites is like SharePoint, drives, devices, and then you can further refine it by saying, okay, you know, I've got users, bill, for example. So it's just that the resource is just a gradual refinement as we go down that URL. And then what we can do is navigate around it, and then we've got these query parameters. So this is the OData piece, where we can do filtering, or we can kind of implement a sort of paging by skipping. We can select certain fields that we're interested in, so we can reduce the payload, so we can make these reasonably efficient. These requests can be quite efficient if we just pull back the data that we're actually interested in, rather than every object associated. So I think probably a good idea is to actually look at this tool, which they've greatly improved actually for exploring the REST endpoint using this Graph Explorer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to now remember everything starts from dev.office.com. And we go to, and they've moved this slightly, it's down here to Microsoft Graph. So now that I'm down at the Microsoft graph, I've got a few options here. Lots of documentation, for example. There's another version of that diagram. Samples and SDKs, which you can explore for different platforms as well. But what we'll look at is this tool called Graph Explorer. So what this gives us is a nice kind of UI web front end where we can build up some of these requests. So I can go here and say run a query against me. Now this is some sample data. I'll log in a minute because we can sign in here with an account, but we'll just look at this sample data that they've provided for us very helpfully. So it's this is Megan Bowen, and so you see there's this URL Graph Microsoft. Now I can't just take this and paste it in the browser or use something like Postman, for example, because I'll get well, it's not a 401, it's reporting that I'm expecting an access token. So we'll explain what access tokens are in a few minutes, but you've got to have an additional HTTP header associated with it that's got this access token.
This looks a little bit like Swagger. Is it somehow same or
yeah, so Swagger is like it formats the it's like a metadata formatting language that you can use. Swagger is more something you'd use if you wanted to generate an API, a wrapper API. So at the moment, we'll look at some APIs in a minute. At the moment, we're just going to call the APIs directly from the endpoint. But as we're going to further through the talk, we'll look at some wrapper APIs, and typically what they do is they use something like Swagger and then run a tool in. Usually they use a tool that they have called Viper, V-I-P-R, another fun spelling, which will go through and generate an API. So all of these APIs are generated from the metadata. So there is I can't remember exactly what it is, but it says now you put $metadata on the end of here, and it's not that, it's something like that, and then it'll return a chunk of metadata that you can then use to analyze the endpoint and then generate a wrapper API, perhaps strongly typed as well, around that endpoint. And that's a common technique that you do if you are building the API itself, the wrapper API in whatever language it is that you want to support. So I can start sort of typing in here. I can say sites/root, for example. It might not be any data here, but yeah, there is a root site here. But rather than type it from memory and try and figure it out, they've given you a rather helpfully a set of sample queries here. So I can just hit get, for example, and it'll run a query here for, well, that's just my profile, we saw that already. Get some messages back, and it'll run that. So you can now see what form that query or what form the URL is. You can try it against the beta endpoint as well. Often you'll find that you get a little bit more data back with the beta endpoint than you do with the version 1. So that's like the sort of the preview version of it. So in this case we get, I think with this particular request, we get a more rich set of data back in the beta endpoint than we do in the version 1 endpoint. And so that was my mail. But we can also, another thing we can do is there's a history down here. You can see that we can revisit ones that we just tried, but there's also if I click on this, it says more samples. So I can say, well, let's add SharePoint sites, OneNote, we'll have Outlook Mail, maybe anything else interesting, Planner. We can kind of light up a few more of these sample queries in here. So this list is a little bit longer now, so I can start sending more of these. I need to be logged in to do that one, but I can look at Planner. I don't know if there's any sample data in here. Yes, there is. So you can build up various different queries here, and you can use that now. Having got that, you can use that in the application, get you started when you want to work out what the API endpoint or the REST endpoint is that you want to call. Now I can sign in with an account here. So that's well, that's the sample, which is oh no, I don't want that one. Wait a minute. I want this one, and sign in with that. So this is just a test tenant in Office 365 that I set up, and now it's running against an actual live tenant. So you might want to be a little bit careful here, because some of these endpoints can delete objects, so you wouldn't want to accidentally delete something you didn't intend to on your live tenant, but probably more something you'd use, maybe set up a test tenant to work with. So I can do things like I can send an email. I can do a post here and say, yeah, let's send this email. So now there's a request body that gets set up because it's posting data back to the server. So the request body comes into play here. So that again contains JSON data, and we can run that query against the server, and then that's given me a status 202, which is success. So if I logged into this tenant now, which I think I could probably do, as long as I get the same tenant. Which I think is my live one. Is it? No, this is the right one. Yep. So if I go to mail, I would expect to see that. I don't see it actually. I think this might be a different one. I think I connected to a different. Oh, here I sent from the Microsoft Connect sample. I think that's a different one actually. Anyway, that's the Graph Explorer, and you get some links to the documentation here as well. So if you want to click on that, it'll take you straight to the documentation for that endpoint. So that's the Graph Explorer. I think we looked at this one already. So we've talked quite a bit about tokens. I kept saying this token, this bearer token that we have to attach to these requests. So if you were, say, in SharePoint and you were on a SharePoint site and you're authenticated and you want to make a request against the SharePoint REST endpoint, you don't normally have a problem because you've got an authentication header which is going to get attached to every request you make. So you don't have a problem in getting permissions to those objects. But if we make a request against the Microsoft Graph, we need an access token because it's a different endpoint. So what we need to do is attach one of these bearer tokens. So a bearer token is a bit like money, or you get a ticket, a drinks ticket somewhere. It doesn't really know. They don't care who you are as long as you hold one of those tickets, or like just like cash, you can get some drinks from the bartender will give you a drink even if you just found it on the floor. Whereas if I go to the airport check-in with my boarding pass, it's not enough to have the boarding pass. They want to see my passport as well to check that I'm the person identified on the boarding pass. So that's like there's our identity. And so in these topics we differentiate between authorization and authentication, where authentication is who you are and authorization is what you're allowed to do. So you can actually, this is an example of kind of authorization only, where this person is authorized to have a drink, but there's nothing about their identity. So you kind of have to separate those two terms, and I frequently find myself using the term authorization when I meant to say authentication, and vice versa. So it's an easy mistake to make, and you have to try and keep those concepts separately. So if you just use authentication and have a trusted subsystem. You know, you log into something, you give it your username and password. That's how I'd use some sort of trusted subsystem. That's not so great if I just want to give, say, permissions to an application that I want to use to call in and say get some identity information. I want to make a call without giving them the keys to the kingdom, and if I give them my username and password, then they can do anything they want. So the idea is to come up with an approach that gives some limited permissions to do something, or gives an application limited permissions. So there've been various attempts at doing this kind of thing. There was the first thing was trying to avoid the problem of everybody having to be an identity provider. So Passport was an approach to that. The problem was with Passport, I think, it was proprietary, and this is Microsoft Passport, if you remember, and it was you had to pay them to be able to provide that service. So OpenID came along, and that was like an open way of doing it. So if you go to Stack Overflow, for example, which I bet a lot of you do, you don't sign in to Stack Overflow. They don't have an authentication system. You sign in with Google or Facebook or Twitter or something, and the Stack Overflow people let Google worry about authentication and keeping all that information secure and managing people who have forgotten their password and getting them to logged in and so on, and they delegate that to Google. And so that's what the OpenID is designed to do. And OAuth is another protocol for when you want to give authorization. So the auth in OAuth is authorization. Give somebody authorization to some application. And then they brought out a new version called OAuth 2, which has a bit of controversy around it because it uses these bearer tokens that aren't really protected. They're not encrypted in any way. So you have to be very careful that you protect them by sending them over HTTPS. You don't leave them lying around on, say, in a browser, which would be bad because browsers are notoriously easy to hack into. So there's one of the criticisms of OAuth 2, and the author of that standard actually resigned from it because they felt that it didn't really force people down a path of being secure just because they implemented the OAuth 2 standard. You've still got to take steps to make sure that the code you've written is secure. And so the general recommendation is don't try and write your own code to do this stuff. So we'll look at the tokens and how they work. So it's useful to understand how it works, but you probably don't want to be in the business of writing your own authentication code, and so they'll use libraries to do that rather than write the code ourselves. And then if you hear OpenID Connect mentioned, that's an extension to OAuth 2 that is kind of the new version of OpenID that gives you authentication by means of OAuth. So quite a few people tried to build authentication solutions on top of OAuth 2, and they all got hacked because they weren't done securely. So OpenID Connect is a mechanism that they've come up with to give you authentication built on top of the OAuth protocol, or the OAuth standard, I should say. So all these things are kind of interconnected. You can have tokens that carry identity with them as well, but they don't have to. So this OAuth 2 standard's about 75 pages long. It refers to other standards. It's not something to undertake lightly, and I've decided actually not to go through the whole of this today, much to your disappointment. There are OAuth 2 authorization flows, of which these last two are probably the most important: the authorization code flow and the implicit grant, and there are other ones that you can use as well. The endpoints don't really know which flow you're using. They're kind of like design patterns. You know, this is a way that you can use the endpoint to do this or that, as long as they support it. So we'll look at implicit grant and the authorization code flow, because that's the ones that we tend to mostly use. So we've got various pieces to the authorization puzzle. We've got the resource owner, we've got the resource server, it might be Exchange or SharePoint, whatever the back-end system is. There might be a client application, and this is confusing terminology because when they say client application, that might be a server application, but it's a client to the resource server. And we've got these access tokens and the data, and I'll just try and quickly go through this. And a user agent, so it might be a browser, or that might be all one thing running as, say, a mobile application, on a device, for example. So the kind of username password flow, which we talked about, we go off and we get a username and password, but the sort of username and password is everything in the whole chain knows about the username and password. So there's no real possibility to which one was that? Oh, sorry, yeah, username, password. I clicked a few. The username, password, we trust the system with our password. That's the danger. Now this, we've got to know that system is going to protect that password, otherwise they can get to, the hacker can get to anything. So the implicit grant flow is what we'd use if we were building something like a single page application or something that's running in the browser. And how that works is we get the, we go and get the consent from the, this is not making the explanation any easier. This is going to be a problem, I think. All right, I wonder if this will settle down in a second. It's not the easiest things to explain without it suddenly going forward too far and too fast. Right, let's do the explicit grant. So we kind of give it, we do an authentication step which bounces us off to this authentication endpoint, and then it will give us back the access token, which is I'm representing by this key, which we can then use to access the resource at the endpoint. So the intention is that this key, this access token, is fairly short-lived, and it's intended for a sort of a short period of access to it. So this is the correct flow to use if you're doing something like a single-page application. You can't really. It's a compromise. You can only minimally protect the access token, and that's I call that a slightly trusted subsystem. Okay, and then the authorization code grant, which we also hear about a lot, is this slightly more complex flow where we go to the authorization endpoint and it gives us back this authorization code, which is very short-lived and just gives us temporary access, and we pass that down to this, what I've labeled the somewhat trusted subsystem. So this might be like some web application, and then it's going to come and once it's got the authorization code, it can go back to the server and get the access token, which it uses to access the resource. So at no point does the web application see the no point does the client application see the access token. It's always the web application, whatever it is, so some server. It's to some extent protected, because anything that's happening in the browser a hacker can get to, whereas it's much more difficult to get to something here. So that's why we use that authorization code. It seems to be a long way around to get at it, because a lot of people ask, well, what's the point of this authorization code? And it's to avoid the need for the browser to see this access token. So the access token is the valuable thing. That's a valuable piece of information that would be very useful to a hacker, and particularly if they got this second token, because you actually get two. You get an access token and a refresh token, and the refresh token allows you to get more access tokens, and that's how these systems, it can be set up and you sign in with them, and then it can keep getting another refresh token an hour later and keep that going for weeks, perhaps a couple of months, depending on how the the authorization is set up. And so you can be using these trusted these web servers for quite a long period before you get another authentication prompt, which is what users hate. So that technique is, this authorization code is designed for where you're building some sort of web service or some web server that's going to protect the access token, and the implicit flow, which was the previous one, is kind of where everything's running in the browser or on some device. And you can do some tricks here, like what they'll often do is they'll keep a hardened browser window open if it's on a device that can keep getting more access tokens. But at no point is one of these refresh tokens aren't involved, so you don't have that very long-term risk. So this is what these tokens are in what's called a JOT format, JWT, pronounced JOT, where the J stands for JSON, which stands for JavaScript Object Notation. Now we've completely unpacked the acronym, and it itself is packed inside, but it's only base 64 encoded. You see, it's not encrypted, so if a hacker can get hold of that, they can get hold of the information inside it. So we're relying on the transport layer security, SSL, to protect those. That's why we have to use HTTPS when we use these kind of techniques. All right, well, and then the token lifetimes are, there's this access code. So that's incorrect. That authorization code, not access code. This authorization code is very short-lived, so it's only got a lifetime of about a minute. So once you get it, you have to use it straight away. Otherwise, it's no longer valid. Okay, so I've talked more than I intended about that. But there's a tool you can use. It's a little bit outdated, called the OAuth Sandbox. So if I go to OAuth play.azure, so this is the URL, OAuthplay.azurewebsites.net, and if you go to that, you can actually say there's a Sandbox account you can use. So if I might need to open, this is probably not going to work if I do it in this browser instance, actually, because I've already signed in with another account, which is one of the pains of doing this kind of work. Is the browsers tend to hang on with cookies and things to authorization headers and things. So this should work. So authorize using Sandbox account. So you've got to remember that password, pastries 101. Look at these URLs that it's doing as it does the read. So now you see it's now gone off to login.microsoftonline.com. That's the authorization endpoint that it's going to. And then what was that password? Pastries 101, wasn't it? Sign in. So now I've gone to there. So now that I've done that, you see I've now got this authorization code. Where did it get the authorization code? It's right there in the URL, in the query string of the URL. And then what we do then is we use this button here. We'll do another request, which will go off and get from the authorization endpoint the refresh token, the access token, which is the most interesting one. So there's actually an identity token which we get as well. So that's kind of endpoint specific. But the important ones here are the access token. So that will give us the so we would add that to the authentication header. So, and that would have the form bearer space and then that exact string. So it's, as long as we do that, we'll be able to get the data back. And then the refresh token is one we can go back to that authorization endpoint and get another access token once this one expires in about an hour or however it's set up to work. So you can, some people have done this demo where they kind of copy and paste the thing, and it takes quite a, it's an impressive display of technique, but you can do it yourself just by clicking a couple of buttons. You can see what the tokens look like. So that's I think quite a useful demo of the that endpoint probably isn't going to work actually. So there's now when it makes the request, I'm just going to simplify this because I think this is a little bit out of date, this tool, but if you look at the authorization header there that it's added in the request headers, it's got this authorization bearer and then the access token, which is this base64 encoded string. So it's not terribly complicated. You probably don't want to write, that's what the libraries are going to do, so it's useful to know what they're doing. You probably don't want to write that code yourself if you can help it, but that's what's going on behind the scenes. And so if we go back to the slide deck and all this is, that's another topic entirely. I'm going to have another go with a clicker, hope for the best. Nothing to do with browser same origin policy, which is another thing that you encounter in these things where you might have to use cores. People talk about this standard for where there's a header comes back so that you can get around the browser policy that says I can't make a call to some other URL endpoint, and so that it allows it. Cross-origin resource sharing. There are lots of libraries. There are a group called ADAL, so they're often referred to in the plural, ADALs, Active Directory Authentication Libraries, or for different situations and different languages. You can find a lot of those on GitHub, or you can download them with NuGet packages or NPM packages. There's a newer version of it called MSAL, Microsoft Authentication Library, that's intended to run against this new V2, which I'll talk about in a second. There's these Office 365 client libraries that you can get, which and one of these is called Office Dev PNP JS Core. That's now adding, somewhat at my request, the Microsoft Graph endpoint as well. So this is a very nice library. It's early days for it, but I think this will be really interesting to see how that develops as a wrapper library for the Microsoft Graph, as well as all the other things like the SharePoint libraries, which is primarily for SharePoint. But there are numerous libraries that you can pick from, and there's a quick start actually is just one other thing I want to show in, I've just about got time to do it, on the endpoint, or that site, which was, if I go back to wherever it was here, so I was back at Graph, so I've gone dev.office.com and then to Microsoft Graph, and then if I instead go to Quick Start, there's a whole bunch of just bit like sort of hello world, but using the Microsoft Graph that you can use. So here's one for ASP.NET MVC, for example. I need to get an app ID and secret, so I can use this thing here, and I'm going to sign in with that same account that I was using, which was fucom.onmicrosoft.com. and sign into that, and it's now going to go to Azure AD and set up an application in Azure AD. If I had a bit more time, we could go to Azure AD and see how it stores all these different application identities. So it's setting that up right now. It's done that. I'm going to copy that and put the app secret in here, and now I can generate a sample. It's a zip file which I've now downloaded, shown folder, and then I'm going to extract all. I don't like that name very much. You can see I tried this before. And now I have got a, down here I've got Visual Studio project, so I'll open that in Visual Studio Community Edition, completely free, and I get all these security warnings. So I just get rid of those because I trust it. And now I can go in here, and I've got a project. You can see that they've added some various NuGet packages here for. If I scroll down here, I've got Microsoft Graph somewhere. Here we are, Microsoft Graph and Microsoft Graph Core. So that's all been set up for us. You could do a similar thing if you wanted to by doing, if you had a project that you already created, you could go and do a add connected service, wherever it is. I don't see it. Add connected. There it is. Yeah, add connected service would be another way of going about it. But this has been done, and then I've got some let's look at models here. See, the model is strictly it's kind of a data access layer, I suppose, but it's calling back to this graph service. So we've loaded up the Microsoft Graph in here. I've got a reference to it, and then we've got various method calls here to this sample, which is to do with sending emails. So if I run that, and that would make a good starting point if you wanted to build a project. Use that as the initial, rather than scaffold out using file new project. You could start with one of these and build on that, and they've already done a lot of the work for you. This will start up in a moment. While we're waiting for that, let's just go over to GitHub, not SharePoint. I'm going to go to GitHub/Microsoft Graph. And let me just filter this on, because this example we've got coming up is C#, but we can do JavaScript as well. So there is also a library, this one, MS Graph SDK JavaScript, which is a library that the Microsoft Graph team have created. It's not quite the same as the one I was referring to earlier. This one, you've kind of got to tell it what the endpoint is that you're heading for. But it does give you a strongly typed object back. Well, the C# version does. And if what's I going to show here? I've forgotten. I think I might have, that other application might have started. Oh, still waiting for this to start. Why hasn't this started yet? Is it because I've already logged in one of these other things? What if I stop that and refresh? Will that bring it back, bring it to life? Did so want to show this? What is it waiting for? Ah, we've got it. It's there, right. So what we can do there is we can click this button and say get email address. So what that's going to do is it's going to bounce us off again, and we get the login prompt again. So I'll just do that again. Orlando. Don't want you. And now I get a consent dialog. Okay, so this is going to ask me for some. This is where you specify what permissions you want to give the application. So it's going to ask for consent, and we can accept that. So there's a similar thing in the Graph Explorer actually. If I can go back, I think I've closed that page off. But in the Graph Explorer, you can also do a similar sort of thing. And so one of the things with the version 2 of the endpoint is you can have these incremental permissions, and you can ask for permissions as you need them, which is a nice feature. So this has come back and has given me back my email address, so it's made a successful call, and we could run Fiddler and see what it was doing as well. We can do this send an email, and it will actually go off and send an email. So this is all happening from within the C# code that's running in that sample that I generated. I think it has now sent the email, and probably if I go to the, if I'm logged in somewhere here, that's the one. This is what it's just sent to the mailbox in Office 365 of that tenant. So that is how to get up and running very quickly, and I'll just quickly mention that we've got these various additional things coming in, more client libraries, and this V2 endpoint, which is really interesting because apart from it's got this incremental consent where you can, you don't have to decide ahead of time what permissions you need. If they click on the thing to send a mail, then you give them the incremental consent to add that extra permission. There's also a nice thing that it's the same endpoint that works with both these organizational accounts and the Microsoft accounts, so like a live.com account as well, which greatly increases the reach of that endpoint. So we can also do, or coming soon is app-only permissions, which is another feature. So do you use the Microsoft Graph or one of these legacy, the existing endpoints? And that really depends on what you're trying to do. So I think you can probably say that these very old APIs like CSOM, EWS, probably going to fall behind now as they invest in these newer ones. The REST APIs are going to probably always have the latest material in. Then the language-specific wrappers are going to be always one step behind. The quicker ones will be the auto-generated ones using tools like Viper that automatically generate the API code. The Graph REST API is always going to be a step behind that because they've got to update it to wrap these other APIs. And then the Microsoft Graph language specific wrappers that have to be generated from that REST API will be kind of the next ones to get each of these features. So if you want the very latest features, your best bet is to use these native REST APIs, raw REST APIs, and then that's sort of the sequence depending on how much you need to be on the cutting edge. So just for fun, a scary thought, I think we'll see a lot of AI behind these. As this grows, I don't think we'll get AI. We'll be able to kind of figure out, going back to the sort of the brain analogy, and quite a scary thing is this is things like cognitive services, image analysis, the classification. This is the error rate in 2011 was about 25%, so we thought, okay, not that useful, but fun. And we've now reached the point, or beyond the point, where the error rate is less than 5%, which is significant because that's the error rate for actual human beings. So we've kind of got the point where the AI is more efficient than a human being at identifying things. So the question that kind of ask yourself is, well, where will all this end? And if you read some, this is a fairly academic book, a sort of alarmist view that there's a danger that there'll be a sudden takeoff of AI and machine learning, that they'll suddenly become so clever that they kind of outthink us and take over the world. So I don't want to worry you, but this is very powerful technology, so we should use it with care. So great open standards, operability. I think it's worth understanding how these various libraries work and what they're doing, so when things go wrong you understand it. I don't think you should hack your own security code. I think we should use these libraries wherever possible. And this Microsoft Graph, which is this all-encompassing wrapper library, I think is the one that we're going to use more and more as time goes on, and it's going to give us this ability to make these incredible applications that can just reach in and find everything about an organization and draw all kinds of conclusions from things that it just really, the limit is our imagination, what kind of applications we can build. But you know, I think the takeaway was we've got to be agile, preferably with a large A, because it's a very fast changing field. And so I'll put it right back round to Ted's original topic that he talked about this morning. Anyway, I hope that was useful. There's a bit of recommended reading if you want to find out more, and I don't know if we've got time for questions, but I hope it was useful anyway. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Thank you.